Bradley, welcome. How are you and where are you?
Hey Tim, great to connect. Doing really well. And I'm in New York City right now.
New York City. Okay, so hi from Bali, big time difference. Appreciate your time jumping on. Want to talk with you about Roll, obviously your project. A lot of stuff happening there. I think it's very interesting. I want to dive into this, but first, as far as I know, you are big believer or advocate of what I think yourself and others call like Web 2.5 rather than, hey, it's going to be all Web 3 or it's Web 1 and this is never going to work, and the Americans or the Chinese are going to prohibit it. So what is it? It's Web 2.5 is the future. What is it about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could really break this down into just users, right? So on average, there's about 5 billion, let's say, monthly active users of the internet on Web 2. Web 3 collectively, you can just look at wallet growth. There's around 20 to 30 million monthly active users around. That's a big gap in terms of users and growth. To get to something like a billion Web3 users, there's going to need to be some sort of bridge that the 5 billion folks in Web 2 are pretty familiar. Likely you'll have to meet them where they are. So likely you'll have to meet them on the platforms they use and integrate crypto assets in ways they understand. And we consider this Web 2.5. So the only iteration, the only difference is bringing crypto assets to the mainstream by incorporating them into Web 2 technologies. And so in a nutshell, this is Web 2.5. So it seems pretty obvious in retrospect, but that's the thesis on which we've kind of built Roll and our infrastructure.
Just that before we go into Roll further, but what do you think is like or has been the best example of this kind of like Web 2.5 that we have seen where you would go, hey, this is the example that, kind of underlies the case that we're trying to make here that, can be related to your own project, other project. But what do you think what have we seen in the past that everyone can kind of relate to?
Yeah, so we call like Coinbase a Web 2.5 company in terms of crypto assets, things like stable coins. So everyone's in the world is familiar with a dollar. Having a digital dollar isn't too much of a stretch. So things like that, and just infrastructure around custodial wallets, which is something we really focus on. That your cousin, your niece, your aunt, your grandma can just kind of use. If they could use something like Facebook or Twitter, they could use crypto, and kind of plug in and start playing with these tools.
I think that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it this way, but you just said it. Like take Coinbase as a kind of Web 2.5 company. You also mentioned stable coins, and I imagine you're thinking collateralized whatever USDC, BUSD as 2.5. Would you say, hey, USDC as an example really is a Web 2.5 technology? I mean, it's not that I don't buy into it, but it's the first time I think about it this way. Is that how you're thinking about it?
Sort of, yeah, you could argue either point. The idea is it can just sort of thematically it can be incorporated into people's lives. You could draw a clear line between something that's in their pocket or in their bank account and USDC.
Yeah, I mean, just by the fact that it's collateralized with the fiat currency kind of is this kind of reality of being between the old world and the new world. What do you think? Let's jump forward, 5 or 10 years, and somebody writes, history, and, kind of describes how we went from Web 1, to forward, to 3. What do you think history is going to say? What made the big difference? Like, hey, there was this early days was Bitcoin, Ethereum, that, and then, what happened really was this, and this is really this was the game changer. And going forward and I'm projecting backward, what do you What do you think is that going to be?
Yeah, so I suppose two analogies here. You could think of Web 1 as maybe like, read access to content, and Web 2 as like, read and write access to content. So I could publish my own, content there. And we've had this, it's content's now ubiquitous across the internet. And Web 3 brings this sort of, read and write access to capital, which is interesting. And so this is where something like Roll becomes very interesting. If you have like write access to money, if you can create your own currency, just historically throughout technology, why wouldn't it be as big or bigger than content? As long as the infrastructure is there. So Roll is infrastructure that allows people to create their own fungible tokens, as we call them. In the form of online communities, you could also think about this term that became really popular in Web 2, this idea of user-generated content as a bucket. And so the things in user-generated content like videos, likes, everything we're familiar with, kind of fits into that bucket. Now that you have a backend that can give read and write access to capital, this sort of shifts from user-generated content to the next phase, which you can call user-generated capital. And so in the phase of user-generated capital, we're seeing two kinds of capital emerge, which are interesting. So there's capital around things like art, music, blogs, different sorts of things, and this is taking the form of NFTs. And then we're seeing capital around community. And largely we're seeing this as sort of a more fungible, the community represents value in the sameness through whether it's a DAO or something like this. And so this is taking the form of digital currency or ERC20s or kind of whatever equivalent on another chain. And then you have NFTs. And so we're very excited about this trend and being the infrastructure there. So I think Web3 will be remembered as really the first time you have like right access to capital, and this just making these concepts ubiquitous. So in 5-10 years, people won't think twice about having an online presence and a token as well.
Do you think the tokens and the kind of community building around tokens will become kind of what, in a positive way, what kind of social media made Web2? Do you think it's going to be the most important driver, or the main driver, or how do you look at it?
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember when Instagram came out, and people originally thought it was crazy, or even before, to like post what you're eating or kind of different things. This idea of having your own channel about like, here's everything that's happening in my life was a crazy thing. And then people started getting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of followers, and it just became how the internet worked. And this happened because the economics of that now made sense. So if you subtract the economics from, hey guys, here's what I'm doing today, it doesn't really work. But once you add the economics in through brands or advertising or whatever, it starts to work. So yeah, I mean, once the proper economics are in place for everyone to have a token, it makes a lot of sense for them to have a token.
So if the economics in social networks, better social media, was all about advertising and everything that came with it, right, which is highly controversial, what is the economics for communities when you use tokens?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So Web3, thematically having right access to capital is the idea of really owning the things that you put out onto the internet. So that's a fundamental difference between Web 2 and Web 3. And so that is a feature and not a bug. So ownership as a feature allows the community to have way more things. So if we're having this conversation and I'm on Tim's YouTube channel and I'm following and subscribing, you don't own the relationship that I have with you. The platform owns that. Fundamentally, if you have a Web3 framework in this world, if I'm getting Tim coins for listening and hanging out, or maybe subscribing, or I'm on your Patreon or some sort of subscription model, and I receive tokens for this, you start to begin to own that relationship a lot more, and that can evolve, of course, in a financial way as well through all the Web3 financial tools we're seeing. So ownership as a feature becomes super important and interesting to sort of grow a community. Communities don't naturally have their own capital. That's sort of an alien concept that we're moving to the forefront. Historically, you can think of things like social capital and social currency. All we're really doing is like rendering that real, in the next few years.
So, this is great that you brought this up with the Tim coin, and I got to come back to that in just a minute. But give us a rundown on Roll and how it got started. So I'm particularly interested in, I'm also interested in what are the latest features that are rolling out and use cases. But I'm really interested, from you in a kind of founder perspective to, how did it get started? Like, what was the idea? What did you see? How did you get into Web3, and what happened, or what did you see was missing that drove you to, hey, I'm going to start this thing?
Yeah, so I just have a background in economics, and one of my favorite books is a book called Rethinking Money. Would highly recommend that. It's by Bernard Leiter. He's the co-creator of the euro, and they talk about the whole 100-year plus history of things like supplementary currencies. So in Japan, there's a currency called the Furi Aikipu, and it's an elder care currency. So elders can give it to young folks to help them wash dishes or cross the street or kind of do things. And what you start to see is, these are alternative currencies to drive incentives within local communities. In Belgium, there's a currency called the Tareki, and it's given to other populations to kind of help them move along, almost just sort of clean up neighborhoods or go to movies or get food or kind of things like this. And so the idea of like supplementary currencies is interesting because it's something blockchain has enabled us to do, and also just kind of grew up looking at things like the creator economy and how that emerged from 2010 to 2020, and just also kind of changed the internet and internet economics as well. So there's this wave of people coming on the internet, starting communities. And, the question is, the first question was, do they want a supplementary currency that can exist not only in the platforms that they use, but also outside of the platforms they use? And so the answer to that first question was a resounding yes. And so once we had our first, 10 or so folks that were like, I want my own digital currency, this became very interesting.
What's that? Roll me, give us a date to that.
Yeah,
like when
it's around like 2019, 2020. So we launched on Ethereum mainnet around like 2020, and from there, this was like before the NFT boom, but we had a few NFT creators, and then once the NFT boom happened, it just kind of scaled, and folks just started having tokens along with their NFT collections and things like this, and we started to have massive creators, and then we launched at the same time. Uniswap V1 launched. So the first thing we did was fork their front end and made these things valuable for people that wanted to do that. So we have tokens with markets and more valuable, and some of my friends' startups and companies, like 8-figure range and 9-figure range, and all that's very cool. We'll see a lot of those in the future, but we're more obsessed with the infrastructure that allows us to reach hundreds of millions of users. We're interested in those types of numbers and plugging into networks and chains that also make that possible. So our underlying thesis, if you will, in a simple sentence, is plug any token on any chain into any platform.
Perfect. So what's the, you just said that, you got a bunch of, projects that, have a higher market cap than, the startups of your friends, very likely. Give me like one or two, like really good examples from the past that have been very successful in what they have done and how the tokens create value there. And then, you mentioned this, maybe some of the most recent examples from, last few weeks, what has happened there. Be very, very interested in that.
Yeah, so I'll tell you how the company has evolved a little bit. So originally, a Roll token meant, Tim comes to Roll and mints a token through Roll's smart contracts and infrastructure. It then gets plugged into Roll's app, which has a bunch of features that allows Tim to create links and plug into applications and can send tokens to people on the 5 billion Web2 side of the internet. So this was how we originally started. So a roll token, is people kind of coming into roll and kind of minting tokens. So some of the really cool tokens that are out there, Shepard Fairey has a token. So the big American graffiti artist called Obey after his Obey Giant group. So that's very interesting once things kind of reach that scale. Whale Shark is kind of one of the biggest NFT collectors in the world, and he very famously has a vault of NFT collections valued very heavily, or valued very greatly in sort of like the high 8 to 9 figure range. And he has a token to kind of represent the community around the vault, I'll say. And so that community has grown substantially. People get to kind of choose things now that can enter or exit this vault. And he and many others have popularized this idea of a community as a digital asset. So if you're on YouTube, if you're the founder or CEO of YouTube, you may think of community as a channel. If you run Twitch, you may think of community as a stream, Discord community as a server. We think of community as a digital asset that can plug into all of those things and have its own value built around all of those networks. So folks like Whale Shark and very popular NFT creators like Xcopy has a token on roll called Doom. And just the list goes on. So a lot of these folks have made their tokens available on Uniswap and have built markets and trading volume the same way you've seen with other tokens in the space.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so run me, through this, and I got to be totally selfless here and ask you to, for anyone that's listening to this, I think I'm a perfect example in many ways, especially with this podcast, of like being involved in Web3, but not being, extremely socially active online. Okay. So, there's a few tweets about this. There's a website for the podcast. We're putting some stuff on YouTube. There is really no other conversation happening apart of the conversations that I have with people like yourself, and that goes out and, and media on the internet. What would be, from your experience, a real use case, and more importantly, a roadmap that makes sense, where you introduce a token here, if it makes any sense at all? Run me through it. What you would be, you're my Web3 community consultant.
Sure.
For anyone like myself that has a small, very specific audience, how would you go about it? What can you do? What is of value, for the people that are, today listening, and as well as value to people involved in the production? What would you do? What's a good example here?
Sure. Yeah. So in our world, tokens are for anyone online that wants to build a community. So we'll kind of start there. So if Tim wants to build a community with his podcast, do all the things you're normally doing. Start building your community, doing podcasts. And let's say all of a sudden, you have tens of users, tens of listeners, and people are starting to tune in, etc. Roll is functionality that can begin to plug into those applications that people use to listen to your podcast. So one of the first things that you could do with Roll, so we'll debut this later this year, is you can plug into podcast apps, and you can start to deposit tokens into those pieces of media. So you could say, hey, the first, I know we have tens of listeners right now, but I'm going to make a big broadcast. This next podcast that I'm doing, or this next season of 10 podcast episodes, if you listen on this particular streaming app, you will receive tokens for just listening to this podcast. And so all of a sudden, there's this law, that people kind of talk about, or idea of like, your top 100 or top 1,000 fans, and sort of kind of bifurcates there. Kind of that's all you need to build a community. So all of a sudden, there's people that believe in you, and now they can represent their belief in you in a new way that they couldn't previously to listens. They couldn't even show off those listens in a peer-to-peer way. Brad and David, as fans of Tim's podcast, we really can't, differentiate how much we like that podcast, how much David likes that podcast more than me, or vice versa. With tokens, that you begin to do that in a very interesting way. So plugging those tokens in, distributing them, that's something that becomes very exciting. Let's say you want to set up a Discord as well, and so there's just another existence of sort of your community in Discord, as sort of many folks do. So, Roll has features to plug into Discord. So if you want to airdrop or tip, Tim tokens every podcast Friday, or have listening or re-listening sessions on Discord, you could start to do that as well. So you start to see the distribution of tokens as a way to drive and incentivize listenership and community as a real way to build a community. And the folks that I mentioned have done real case studies on this. And so it's really driven us to build specific tools around driving community through tokens. And we've become very proficient at this.
Give me a bit on the, specific. So how would the integration with the podcast stuff work? Like this would be like very specific apps, because I guess you can't just integrate in any form with something like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or like how would this actually work?
Yeah, so in a very fun way, we kind of like the name Roll because it just simplifies a very fun way to move stuff from A to B. It's kind of a name that represents the moving of something from one point to another. And so Roll is really generalized, unopinionated infrastructure for the transfer or transaction of tokens. And so what that means is we don't have an opinion on how those tokens are moved, but if there are platforms that can plug into our APIs, that's when it starts. And for platforms that are at scale, we can do things like Chrome extensions. And so, for something like, let's say, YouTube or Spotify, if we didn't have relationships there, we would create something like a Chrome extension. And so, when you hop on your Spotify, you can say, hey guys, I'm going to be giving out some Tim tokens. Download this Chrome extension. It's in the show notes, and you guys will receive Tim tokens at the end of the week. And so that could be a very easy way you start to do this. And we'll have some natural integrations with platforms as well, and more native with things like Discord, Telegram, other things like that.
Very cool. What is one of the examples of content producers that are not natively in Web3? I obviously, whatever, an NFT artist and so on, I see their very kind of native relationship to what you're doing. What do you think is from a non-obvious case of things that you've seen that has been very offline, or has been very Web1 or Web2, that has experienced with your project a significant transformation into this Web 2.5 or Web 3.0?
Yeah. So concepts like fungible tokens are really there's applications of this, some that we can understand and fathom, and some that we can't fathom for many years. This could represent digital citizenship in the future, or kind of many other things. But one cool thing, we haven't hit the button on this, but things like loyalty, the idea of getting airline miles or loyalty points, we've seen folks sort of replace this as well. So when you could think of any sort of e-commerce, post-purchase reward experience. So instead of that being these, rinky-dink points that you can't exchange or you can't give to your friends or anything like that, you could start to reimagine a world where the backend for that is blockchain based, and it works seamlessly in, a Shopify or any sort of e-commerce environment. But it could also plug into, wacky Web3 stuff like, staking and derivatives and many other things. And this kind of reinvents, loyalties. If you could plug loyalty into a derivatives market, you could start to short an airline program like that.
It's a very. Do just curious on this side, what is the biggest, or what are the most prominent cases today for the reward points that are actually brought on chain? Do you have a clear picture on that? I'm just curious.
So there's a few companies trying to think through it. We as infrastructure won't probably have a loyalty based application, but we'll power that, right? So this is the beauty of Roll. So we won't be a streaming company, but we'll power the folks that want to bring tokens into streaming. And so right now there's probably some American Express loyalty person who's been working in loyalty for 20 years and is watching what's going on and has all the connections and can get thousands of brands involved. But they're not technical, and Web3 is kind of new to them. And it's really hard to build that infrastructure. That's kind of a separate business. That's why PayPal exists and Stripe and all these sorts of things. So they can come to Roll and build build Loyalty 3, their new application, and they can get a bunch of brands involved, and those brands can get on a minting schedule with Roll and connect those tokens into that Loyalty 3 app and start from there. And so Roll is very excited to start powering applications like that in the future. And that application we just made up, Loyalty 3, like that's a very valuable company. It's an 8-figure, 9-figure business that can start to really plug into brands and kind of upgrade what loyalty is on the internet.
Two follow-up questions on that, which I'm also very interested in. First of all, like from the end user perspective, that's actually 3 questions. Who's under your definition, kind of your customer persona? Like, first of all, like from anyone who's listening to this now, like who would you say, hey, if you are this kind of person or this kind of business or doing this, then you should definitely look at what we're doing. So who's like the persona and or business or organization that you think you have the highest, you provide the highest value to, who should be in this, who, if they're not? And then second, what problem does this persona, user usually encounter when trying to go into this direction? And, how do you solve it? Like what's the biggest or the 3 biggest problems, and what are the 1, 2, or 3 like cool solutions that you bring with Roll to the table here?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer that second question. So or I'll start with the first one. So in terms of the Roll app, it's online communities that want to upgrade their community and start to think about ownership as a feature, and sort of have these tools that create ownership in the
size
community.
Is somebody ideal that has like a community of 10 or 100 or 1,000? And what does community actually mean? Like that you have them already on a Discord, or you have followers and whatever, subscribers in YouTube? Give me an idea who's like, who's the ideal, user here.
Yeah, it's never too early. You could think of something like YouTube's a great example. It's like YouTube has folks with 1 subscriber and 0 subscribers, and then has folks with hundreds of millions. And so it's it's sort of along that scale. All you need to do is want to build a community on the internet, and we could think about community as a digital asset for you. So on the Roll app, that'd be where it starts. And with our developer tools, it's platforms. There's so many founders in our networks that are building the next Spotify or the next HBO or the next net. And so we're talking to them and just developing a timetable on when we want to integrate tokens into game shows and racing games and loyalty and all these sorts of things that we'll be able to power and really upgrade the internet in this way. So that's where I spend a lot of my time, just talking to founders now and helping them integrate tokens into their platforms.
So you have a very strong focus on projects and their founders that are building again projects and applications for the future that are trying to incorporate this capabilities. Is this where you spend a lot of time on?
Yeah, I think Roll would grow something like PayPal, where there's a consumer facing end where Tim's sending tokens to his millions of users that are kind of very excited about your podcast, your community. Maybe you started something else, and Tim tokens represent that too. But also your podcast is on a streaming app, and Roll works with that streaming app as well. So you can just put some Tim tokens into that, set it and forget it, and people are just getting Tim tokens for listening to episodes, doing a bunch of stuff. And so that relationship we have with you is really important, and the relationship we have with the platform is really important as well. So some comparables there that a lot of people know, maybe like PayPal and Stripe. So in those interfaces, Tim can go there and create a store or create an e-commerce angle, and people can just work with you directly or receive that dollar value directly. But those platforms also work with Stripe powers things like Shopify, etc., things like that. So we'll have that relationship as well.
I had 100,000 people listening to the podcast, and somebody would throw $1 million at the podcast investor, and I would go like, "Hey, fuck, now it's really the moment to, launch a token." I'm oversimplifying this, right? What are the things that, me as a content producer then that I would like to do and that are going to be much more difficult than what I expect them to be? And what are the specific solutions that you guys bring to the table there?
Yeah. So whenever you want to start, whenever you want to create a token, is fine. We have folks that are creating tokens for things they haven't built yet, and we have folks with millions of followers on the internet that have tokens as well. So at any point, in your life cycle as a creator or a digital community, you can start to do this. But yeah, the first thing you just want to figure out, and it doesn't really matter, is just the max supply of your token. We have a simple mental math kind of 10 million number that vests over a year period, but we've kind of turned into this like Chipotle of monetary policy, fast casual way. So you can go in and kind of choose your monetary policy. If you want 1 trillion Tim tokens, you can do that. If you kind of whatever you do. So you want to arrange how you want that Tim token to exist in the world. And then you can just any platform that Roll is connected to, you could use. So if we have tools for Discord, you can be like, "Hey guys, join the Discord every Friday, make about 1,000 Tim tokens." And what we're excited about is this is really interesting. When people receive tokens through Roll, it's usually the first tokens they receive that they care about. And that's been true for a really long time. And if you think about that, there's people that you are probably their only connection to Web3. They've heard about Bitcoin and Ethereum, but they're just wacky things that are out there. But they love Tim. So if Tim creates a podcast and has a token and they really like your podcast and you give them Tim tokens, maybe they've never held Bitcoin or Ethereum, and maybe you're the gateway for them to get into this space. And that's something we see time and time again, and something that we're really excited about. So yeah, that would be the basic way to start. So create a token, decide the tokenomics, if you will, and then from there, start dispersing it to the people in your community and using our tools to do that.
Right. All right. Very good. I want to pick up something that, you kind of touched on earlier in the conversation. And, you talked about, infrastructure and tokens on multiple chains and different chains. And I'd mentioned to you this on off before we started, but I've been talking and spending quite a bit of time over, thinking and talking through, what the Web3, Web 2.5, blockchain, multi-chain future will look like. And obviously there's, Bitcoin maximalists and Ethereum maximalists, and, there's people that are saying there's going to be thousands of chains, right? What do you think? What do you think is the future going to look like? Are we going to just have, Bitcoin and Ethereum, or are we going to have like, a lot of chains? And what are these chains good for? What about EVM? What about non-EVM? How do you imagine the blockchain future, no matter if it's Web3 or Web 2.5, whatever we call it?
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty irrational for the next 10 years. So, if you wanted to create Tim Chain and raise $100 million, you could probably do that. Tim Chain may not be sustainable in 5 years because there's Bradley Chain and all these other chains that exist. Eventually, it'll start to become more rational and just reach a steady state. And then it'll have little blips and things like this. So the things that make sense. Boring answer, but the things that make sense will exist, and the things that don't make sense won't. And this means that eventually something will, surpass Ethereum, inevitably. But in the meantime, lots of other chains make sense. Roll's very right now we're on Ethereum and Polygon, but our journey is going to be multi-chain and non-EVM as well. Things like Bitcoin are really interesting to us. If some of your viewers are probably familiar with the concept of BRC20s, so those are interesting. So sort of these semi-fungible assets on Bitcoin that are now getting listed on exchanges and kind of things like this. And so we believe in a multi-chain world. But we'll kind of see where it comes out. Roll is going to go anywhere people want to think about community as digital assets. So immediately that's all chains, and then we'll work with the best ones and connect them into more Web2 platforms.
And two questions. You said, there's something that will surpass Ethereum or will not surpass Ethereum. Clarify that. What are you thinking there?
Oh, it's just inevitable. If you look into the 90s, some of the biggest, computers at that time, Compaq, Galaxy, like these were like the biggest, kind of sellers of the time. And, you can go back to any sort of technology paradigm and kind of think about who were the big players back then. And things just changed. Ethereum, has sort of a great background and foundation in popularizing a lot of these concepts that we work in, DeFi, DAOs, decentralized exchanges, etc. It all started basically on Ethereum. But yeah, eventually, technology is meant to be disrupted. So, I don't think anything currently can sort of surpass what Ethereum is, but, maybe there's some combination of other technology like AI or something that can, develop some other form of a chain that can be useful for everyone. And I could, telepathically send you money in the future. So
it makes us all rich. Like,
so there's a lot of possibilities, but just sort of the inevitable creative disruption.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. Like this idea of inevitable disruption. I like that. Because I would say that a lot of the opinions that I've heard over the last few weeks and months vary a lot in opinion about is it how many chains they're going to be. But I think I've somewhat seen kind of a predominant opinion or bias maybe that tends to say Ethereum is going to be the backbone or settlement layer for this Web3, and inevitably somewhat contradictory, right? Like inevitably be the largest chain, right, with the most economic power. And you're saying there's going to be inevitably some disruption happening. So I think that's an interesting perspective. So you would hold to this? I mean, we can talk again in 5 to 10 years and say, hey, it was the inevitable backbone or it's the inevitable disruption. You're a firm believer in this idea of disruption?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this isn't me. This is kind of a Schumpeter, the economist, kind of just creative destruction and sort of all that. There are things that are really cool too, like Layer 0 is a project that allows protocols to deploy on different chains and sort of things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be a multi-chain world. It'll continue to grow. Web3 will become old at some point, and there'll be a Web4 and a Web5, and so it's hard to kind of see where things will land.
It's a good perspective. Yeah. So do you think, fast forward 5 years, is going to be 100 chains, 10 chains, 1,000 chains? What's your best guess?
Yeah, as many as many as make sense. So I think the next 10 years will be pretty irrational. So people you're kind of seeing a meme coin moment, and so there's this like lag between the first meme coins and now. And you saw that with for any older listeners, like things like DeFi. And so in like 2020 2021, it was like everyone was creating a DeFi project to do these certain things. Now meme coins are the hot thing. So yeah, you'll just continue to kind of see that evolution.
And you said, I think, going back to Roll, you're currently only on Ethereum and Polygon. Is that correct?
Yeah. And so we'll start to think where else makes sense around the EVM. So we just want to go where the space is growing. So if things are growing on Solana or Binance, we'll be there. We want to work with projects and games and communities that are growing and have tokens, and we could help scale their communities.
The top 3 chains, like, I would go, hey, I give you money and the development team, you can implement 3 chains. Which 3 chains would you choose and why?
Yeah, I think just the chains with projects that are growing and kind of interesting. There's a project that I like a lot. They kind of started thinking about this concept of like move to earn. So they just connected to like your phones, and they started to think about it as people move. Can we give them our tokens? And that project is called Sweat Coins. I've been following them a while, and they have a bunch of users. They're on Near right now. So they're doing a bunch of stuff there. The Binance ecosystem is really interesting. There's they have their own terminology, like social-fi is what they call it, and GameFi has become more of a used term there. But there's some really big, like simple apps, like quiz apps, have millions of users and their own tokens. And so plugging into that atmosphere and integrating roll into those quizzes and making that transfer more seamless and allowing it to be the infrastructure for other games and things like that. That's interesting. So realistically, wherever there's big projects, we kind of want to work with them and just connect them to the rest of the internet.
Oh, plan for a next chain in the works or not yet?
Nothing to announce, but yeah, really excited about Polygon. Great team there. There's a lot of projects that are building specifically on Polygon, and it makes a ton of sense with gas and everything. So we'll stay there, and we'll continue to like survey the EVM world and see what makes sense.
Cool. Bradley, it's going to be an inevitable future of change and innovation that seems to be completely unpredictable. Sounds very interesting what you're doing. I'm going to come back to you, maybe do something with the podcast. I love experimenting. As I said, the podcast started as an experiment. It is still an experiment. So, going to try to find some time between the real work to, move that forward. So happy to have that discussion. Thank you so much for your time. This, what is it? Thursday. What is it? Thursday morning for you. I'm going to shut down here. 1:30. I'm going to have the my last bintang and then, head to bed here. Any last words?
No, have a great one. Enjoy Bali. Wish I was there. And yeah, we'll talk again soon.
DAO Talks is brought to you by Grindery. If you enjoyed this podcast, consider subscribing to DAO Talks on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or any other platform you fancy. To find out more about Grindery, visit grindery.io. Thanks for joining me. Tim out.